This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of The Haven Hotel by NikiAlex03, composed by Burning Aurora, Kaliana, and Flowerhawk. November, a year ago. The hotel is nicer than anywhere Remus has ever been. He figures that out the moment they get out of the car, and a valet in a perfectly pressed burgundy uniform comes up to them with a smile and a perfunctory nod, accepting the keys to Sirius's car as he motions for the bellman, who seems to appear out of nowhere, to proceed with getting their bags out of the trunk and onto the trolley. A giant sign looms over them, its letters swooping in an extravagant design. Haven Hotel. Remus stares at it for a moment before moving his eyes downwards. The windows and the doors are all made of frosted glass, obscuring the view of the hotel's lobby behind them. He walks towards it with Sirius at his side, or Sirius walks with Remus at his side. That seems to be the more accurate interpretation of things, and is greeted by an off-white marble floor and a gigantic, sprawling chandelier hovering above them. They end up at the front desk before Remus comes back into himself enough to register that they are walking there. He's pulled back into reality by Sirius's voice in his ear, softly asking him if he's okay, and he feels himself nodding before his brain really has the time to understand the question.
Your usual room, yes, Mr. Black.
The woman at the front desk is asking, a confused lilt to her tone. She is tall and willowy, her black dress accented by minimalist silver jewelry, her dark brown hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her smile is the perfect picture of professionalism, and Remus wonders if she can tell that he is wondering, desperately, what thoughts she is hiding behind it.
Yes, that's correct,
Sirius says. He taps his fingers rhythmically against the marble counter. His other hand reaches towards Remus, resting lightly at the small of his back. Remus's breath catches in his throat at the gesture.
Yes, okay.
The woman says, nodding and typing something on her computer.
I just hadn't realised you would be bringing a guest with you, as your usual suite is.
It was a last-minute decision.
Sirius explains. His smile is equally professional.
Of course, Mr. Black.
The receptionist says, Amy. Remus corrects himself as he spots the name tag fastened securely to her dress. Silver, of course, to match the rest of her adornments. Amy opens the little cupboard behind her and retrieves 2 key cards, handing them both out to Sirius. She does not look at Remus, and Remus doesn't know if it's because he so very visibly does not fit in with the opulence of the rest of the room that she doesn't even bother to acknowledge him, or if it's because he is a man, checking into a single-room hotel suite with another man. Either way, he is too grateful for the small mercy of not being directly perceived to be offended by it.
Enjoy your stay, Mr. Black.
Sirius guides him over to the elevator, with his hands still resting comfortably on Remus's lower back, and Remus tries not to think about what an odd match they are. Him in his worn jeans and one of his plain, albeit nicer, navy blue jumpers, and Sirius in his 2-piece suit, black dress pants and tucked-in white shirt, a black blazer to complete the look. He really doesn't know what he's doing here. The receptionist probably thinks him to be some fancy high-end prostitute, and Remus can't even object to that assumption because, really, is that not what's happening here?
Are you feeling okay?
Sirius asks. They're the only ones in the elevator as the doors slide shut. Remus nods, even though he doesn't think he is, and even if he's certain that Sirius can see right through him regardless.
You've stayed here before.
Remus asks. He hadn't really meant to ask it. It was just another question nudging away at the corners of his mind. But it fulfills its job of filling the silence and making him appear to be a functioning human being as opposed to whatever he's been the past few minutes. Hell, the past few hours. Ever since Sirius picked him up. Sirius hums.
A few times, usually for business.
Usually.
Remus inquires.
Sometimes it's nice to just get out of the city, away from the chaos of it all.
Sirius explains. Remus nods, even though Sirius's words are light years beyond anything he can ever dream of relating to. This would constitute the first vacation he has ever been on. The elevator doors open, and Sirius smiles at him as they step out into the hallway.
No.
He says, and then clarifies when he notices Remus's confusion.
To answer your next question, I've never brought anyone else here before.
Remus blinks, blushing furiously.
I didn't think.
But you did, and it's fine for you to have concerns. Concerns are good, I suppose.
Remus personally thinks that the real problem is that he doesn't have enough concerns. He probably wouldn't have agreed to be here in the first place if he did. They are in Suite 03, the number emblazoned in gold against the door, and it is just as impressively designed and thoughtfully decorated as the rest of the hotel. The floor is hardwood, and the decor is all deep mahogany, dark greens, blues, and creams, natural, earthy tones that give the space a warm, welcoming feel, which envelops Remus the second he steps into it. The wall directly ahead of them is taken over entirely by towering glass windows, the blinds drawn back just enough to allow the light in. Their bags are already here, Remus notices as he looks around. A small suitcase for Sirius and a duffel bag for Remus, just enough to last them the weekend. Remus walks ahead at Sirius's urging, finding himself, almost as if by some instinct, in the bedroom. He stumbles on the threshold and flushes at the sight of the bed, king-sized with a dark wooden headboard and white sheets. There is a small welcome basket on the table near the bedroom door, containing a bottle of wine and some chocolates, both of which Sirius examines as he enters the room behind Remus, turning the bottle over in his hands with expert proficiency to check the label. He hums pleasantly before turning his gaze over to Remus.
Do you like the suite?
He asks as he leans against the wall, right beside the door, observing Remus carefully. Remus, standing in the middle of the room, imagines he feels similarly to what a bug feels when it gets caught in a spider's web.
Do you even need to ask?
Remus asks, laughing a little at the incredulity of the question. Of course he likes the suite. The suite is perfect. The sleek black car Sirius had picked him up in was perfect. The cozy hideaway restaurant Sirius had stopped at when Remus admitted to being a little hungry about halfway through their drive was perfect. Everything is perfect, and that is the entire problem. Remus isn't used to perfect. He feels entirely out of his depth, and he is afraid it is beginning to show past the point of what even Sirius, with his expert tact and graciousness, can continue to ignore.
I do.
Sirius says,
I have plans for this vacation, Remus, and you not liking the suite might make those plans a bit difficult.
Remus swallows thickly, his mouth suddenly feeling uncomfortably dry.
Oh,
Sirius does not indulge him by revealing any of these supposed plans. Instead, he raises the bottle of wine, extending his other hand towards Remus.
There's a bar section in the living area.
He says casually.
Will you have a drink with me?
Remus can only nod. There is a bar section in the living area, a small one with 2 bar stools overlooking a rather picturesque view of the city's skyline. Remus watches Sirius as he uncorks the bottle and pours them 2 glasses. He's removed his blazer and rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, and he looks just as intoxicating as the wine. Earlier today had been the first time they'd met each other in person, and the very first thought that had flickered across Remus's mind upon descending the stairs of his apartment building to find Sirius waiting for him was that the numerous pictures and video calls they've shared over the past few weeks have not done justice to Sirius's sculpted physique or his near ethereal beauty. Though Remus cannot help but to admire Sirius in all of his glory, it is yet another way in which Remus feels inadequate by comparison.
This is a good brand.
Sirius says as he joins Remus in sitting down, drawing Remus out of his thoughts once again.
Do you drink wine often?
Remus laughs at the question. Not nearly often enough to be a judge of what is good and bad, he wants to say. God, why is he here?
not unless you count the cheap kind you get from the shops at 1 a.m.
He says, feigning nonchalance.
or the stuff they give out at church communion.
They give kids real wine at church communion.
Sirius asks. Despite his furrowed brows, he seems more delighted by this prospect than concerned. Remus smiles.
No, but they do give us the keys to the room where it's kept when we offer to spend our Saturday mornings cleaning the building.
Sirius laughs, and the corners of his eyes crinkle a bit. He's so beautiful, Remus thinks.
I didn't take you for the type.
Sirius says, shaking his head amusedly.
You seem so...
Repressed, high-strung.
Remus suggests. Sirius laughs again, brushing off the self-depreciative note in Remus's words.
No, just not the type of person to steal wine from a church.
He offers up instead. Remus shrugs.
There wasn't really much else to do. It was a small town.
He realizes that he's been simply holding his glass in his hand since it was handed to him, and brings it up to his lips for a tentative taste. Sirius watches him carefully, eagerly.
What do you think?
Remus smiles.
Definitely not the cheap kind you get at the corner store.
No,
Sirius confirms, chuckling.
but it is good, right?
It is bitter and dry and incredibly unpleasant, Remus thinks. But he smiles tightly and nods anyway. It seems very important to Sirius that he enjoys this wine.
It's good.
He says. Sirius laughs at him.
You don't have to say that just to make me happy.
Oh,
Remus lets out a breath of relief. He pushes the glass away from him and makes a face. The aftertaste somehow manages to be worse.
It is perhaps an acquired taste.
Sirius says, smiling as he takes a sip of his own. Remus watches him. There's a gleaming silver watch fastened around his wrist. Sirius had talked to him once about how he collects them. Remus doesn't even own a watch.
why did you choose me?
He hears himself asking. Sirius hesitates slightly, but he doesn't seem displeased by the question.
What do you mean?
He asks.
I mean that you...
Remus says, gesturing pathetically.
You're older, accomplished, successful. You look like that, and you drink expensive wine, and you stay at places like this just to get away. And I don't fit in with all of this, if we're being honest with ourselves. I don't fit in with you. I don't even know what you expect out of being here with me.
I've told you what I expect.
Sirius says, frowning slightly.
Well, yes.
Remus admits, looking down at his hands on the base of his wineglass.
But what happens after this weekend?
I suppose that depends on how well this weekend goes. For both of us. Remus,
Sirius interrupts.
look at me.
Remus had always found Sirius's voice to be undeniably attractive. There had been several nights of Sirius talking to Remus over the phone, his voice low and sultry as he described in explicit detail all the things he wanted to do when they eventually met each other in person, instructing Remus on exactly how and where to touch himself as he thought about those things, ordering him to get himself off while Sirius listened. He is not disaccustomed to Sirius's commands. But it's different now, Remus thinks, hearing it in real life like this. Something inside of him seems to click at the sound of those three little words. There is an edge to Sirius's tone now that hadn't been there before, slight enough that it might have gone unnoticed had Remus been less attuned to this kind of thing. Sirius has been, for the most part, letting Remus guide their afternoon together, not pushing too fast or too hard, not making any overt demands of him. He's only requested and suggested, but never ordered. This, Remus realizes, is an order, and he finds himself obeying it immediately, his eyes back on Sirius's, before he can even fully comprehend that he's done it. Sirius smiles, and he looks pleased, and in that same tone that subtly demands nothing but agreement, says,
Don't look away again.
Remus nods.
Good boy.
Sirius says. Remus flushes, but he doesn't look away, and Sirius's smile widens as he takes another sip of his wine.
That's what I expect.
Sirius says.
I expect you to listen to me, to follow my lead and obey my commands. I expect you not only to do as I say, but to anticipate what I need, what I want, and to do it to the very best of your ability. I expect you to be respectful. As we've already discussed, you will address me as sir whenever we're in a scene together. I expect you to let me know what you're feeling. I expect you to let me know if you like something or if you're uncomfortable with something. You have your safe words if you need us to stop or if you need us to slow down. I expect you to use them. I hope that you'll trust me, but I understand that trust, real trust, might take time. I expect that at the end of this weekend, if everything goes well for the both of us, we will engage in a conversation about pursuing a more long-term commitment to each other. I also expect that you have expectations of me as well.
Remus blinks.
I.
Should I give you some ideas?
Sirius says in a teasing tone. Remus, however, nods. He doesn't think he can verbally express anything with any degree of coherence right at that moment.
If we do pursue a full-time commitment, I'd want to take care of you, not just sexually, but any other needs you have as well. I want to support you in any way that you require it. You're right, I do have a lot of money, and I enjoy spending that money on nice things. I want to share those nice things with you, because you'll be mine, and I take care of what's mine.
So you want what? Is this going to be just sex, or...
I imagine that sex will be a big part of it, yes.
Sirius admits with a chuckle.
But I want other things as well. We'll go out to dinner, we'll travel, you'll accompany me to certain functions and events that I need to attend for business or social reasons. In turn, I will provide you with anything you need to be Not just comfortable, but satisfied. It will be, consider it a mutually beneficial agreement of sorts.
Remus nods slowly, attempting to take all of that in. He feels a bit lightheaded, like he's stumbled into some alternate reality, and his brain is desperately trying to make sense of it all. So he will be a high-end prostitute, basically. A kept boy. Sirius's kept boy, which admittedly does make the whole affair seem much more appealing. He'll be taken care of, which is such a far cry from anything he's ever experienced before that it's almost impossible to conjure up an image of what it would look like. But he likes it. And it's not like the sex is a downside by any means. Remus had been the one to reach out to Sirius. Not that he'd ever expected Sirius to respond. Fueled by the loneliness of his first few weeks in London and the private desire for more that had taken root from years of not knowing anything, really, outside of his childhood home, a small neighborhood in Cornwall, with parents who faithfully attended the local church and prided themselves on being the pinnacle of morally upstanding and decent people, and who tried their very best to raise their son with those same ideals, even if it also meant inadvertently teaching him how to be quiet, how to shrink back into himself, how to lie and evade and pretend that he didn't feel the things he really did so as not to cause other people discomfort or grief. There'd been an app and a few haphazard attempts at conversation with the first set of people he matched with, and then one night he'd found Sirius, and a simple hello had been sent. He'd chastised himself for it afterwards, but he'd been thrilled when a mere 3 hours later there'd been a response waiting for him. He's been happy these past few weeks just talking to Sirius over the phone, happy enough to pack a bag and agree to a weekend getaway outside of London despite never having met Sirius in person before. Happy enough that he thinks he will be more than happy to play the role of Sirius's arm candy / on-call sex partner if that's what Sirius wants from him.
So,
Sirius asks once their conversation has lapsed into a silence that lasts a bit too long.
what do you think?
Remus thinks that he understands now this weekend is a test of sorts. He's determined to pass it.
You mentioned having plans.
He asks slowly. Sirius frowns for a split second, before understanding dawns on his features. He clears his throat, standing abruptly, and Remus finds himself following the action without even thinking about it. With very intentional movements, Sirius moves the 2 bar stools aside so that the bar itself is unobscured.
Come here.
Sirius says, and it is almost hilarious how instantaneously Remus's body responds to the command, as if this, obeying Sirius, was the only thing he was ever meant to do. He stops directly before Sirius, mere inches between them, and there is barely half of a breath before Sirius's hands are on him and their positions are reversed, and Remus somehow ends up with his back against the bar and Sirius's hands on his waist, holding him gently but firmly in place against it. Gently, Sirius tilts Remus's head upwards and presses their lips together. It occurs to Remus that this is the first time they are kissing, and that he spent so many nights lying awake in his bed thinking about this moment and what it would be like, and that not a single one of those dreams that he was able to conjure up in his mind are even close to being as exceptional as the real thing. And then Sirius smiles against his lips and murmurs softly,
I am going to fuck you against every surface of this hotel room until you can hardly stand up straight.
Remus makes a sound that might have been a plea if he'd been capable of forming words, but it instead vocalizes itself as little more than a whimper. When Sirius finally pulls away, Remus's eyes flutter open at the loss, and he finds, despairingly, that Sirius has moved back and is now examining him, with a small, knowing smile playing on his lips at whatever he sees.
Or maybe I won't let you leave the bed at all.
He continues,
Maybe I'll tie you to the post and you can stay there and look pretty all day, until I'm ready to put my cock in you. You do get off on being used. I think you'd enjoy that.
Remus would enjoy that, actually, and Sirius knows it, because he'd made Remus confess it to him along with a list of everything else that Remus would also enjoy. Sirius smirks knowingly, tracing the shape of Remus's parted lips with his thumb. Remus focuses all of his energy into steadying his breathing and standing still.
I think...
Sirius begins, stepping closer again so that there is no more space between them at all. He moves his hand down to cradle the nape of Remus's neck instead. He has several inches on Remus's height, and Remus, who is tall enough on his own to have gotten accustomed to usually being the tallest person in the room, feels infinitely dwarfed by him. He loves it. Sirius leans down and kisses the corner of Remus's mouth.
I think that we're going to be very good together, darling.
Remus breathes out a shaky breath.
I think so too, sir.
Sirius pulls back, a pleased expression on his face, and uses the hand on Remus's neck to guide him into another kiss. He is so distracted by the movement of Sirius's lips against his own that he does not notice Sirius's hands sliding downwards until they come into contact with the bare skin of his stomach. Sirius's fingers curl around the edge of Remus's jumper and tugs it upwards, pulling away so he can slide it up and off of Remus's body entirely, revealing the expanse of smooth, flat skin underneath. Remus has never been particularly self-conscious about his body, if only because he's never had much reason to give it any thought, but he cannot help but wonder what Sirius thinks of him. If he looks too pale, too skinny, if the scar on his ribcage from when he'd fallen off of a tree he'd tried to climb as a kid is too clearly visible. But Sirius looks at him as if he doesn't see any of those things. His eyes darken with want as they travel down the length of Remus's torso, and his hands immediately reach for the front of his jeans as well, cupping Remus's cock through the fabric. Remus jolts at the touch, despite his very best efforts at staying still, but Sirius doesn't seem to mind. Quite the opposite, really.
Does that feel good?
He asks, still palming Remus's length with just enough pressure that Remus is practically crawling out of his own skin with how good it feels, and how much he wants more. Once, when he was 16, a boy in his class had given him a hand job, both of them tucked into the back seat of Remus's father's old car, hidden away in the parking lot of an abandoned building. Neither of them had known what they were doing, and it had been awkward and uncomfortable and slightly painful, and Remus marvels now at the fact that Sirius can give a hand job over 2 layers of clothes better than that boy had done with full skin-to-skin contact, though he supposes Sirius has had a lot more experience.
You're gorgeous.
Sirius whispers. It is so soft that Remus wonders if he'd even meant for Remus to hear it. Sirius releases him and makes quick work of undoing Remus's jeans. He tugs them down just enough that he can reach past them, long fingers closing over the length of Remus's cock and swiping over the bead of precum at the tip of it. Remus bites down hard on the inside of his bottom lip in a desperate attempt to curb the sound that threatens to escape him. Sirius makes a tutting sound.
Don't.
He slides Remus's cock free, hard and throbbing already despite having barely been touched. He feels like a live wire, fully charged and ready to detonate at any given moment. A thumb presses over his slit, focusing there, small circles rubbing with such careful, expert precision that it makes Remus want to scream.
God, look at you.
Sirius murmurs.
I'm going to have so much fun with you.
Yes.
Remus whispers before he has a chance to try to stop himself. Sirius releases him, but before Remus can even think about making his misery known, Sirius gets down onto his knees in one swift movement and leans forward, flicking his tongue against the head of Remus's cock. Remus gasps, a ragged moan being pulled from his throat as Sirius repeats the motion. He's free-falling, he thinks, and he's sure that this is what it feels like when you get to the pearly gates of heaven.
Sirius, sir.
He tries, grappling blindly for something to hold on to. His hands end up in Sirius's hair, sliding down to his shoulders.
Please.
Sirius pulls back. Remus blinks down at him.
Your hands.
Sirius prompts. Remus releases him instantly, apologizing profusely for the infraction. Sirius seems to take pity on him, guiding them back to where they'd been before, clutching at the edge of the bar.
You'll learn how to control yourself the more that we do this. I don't expect you to be perfect the first time, but there are rules, and you will learn to follow them.
Remus nods, and he's happy that Sirius is looking up at his face so that he doesn't notice the way Remus's cock twitches at those words. God, this is exactly what he'd always wanted, what he'd always needed.
Now,
Sirius says. He takes Remus's cock in hand again, stroking him vigorously this time.
I'm going to suck your cock. You're going to stand there and let me do it. And when you're ready to come, you're going to be a good boy and ask me for permission.
Remus nods, slower this time, but Sirius only tightens his grip on his cock in response.
Verbal answers, Remus.
He instructs.
Tell me that you understand.
Yes, sir.
Remus whispers.
I understand.
Sirius smiles appreciatively, and a spark of joy blossoms in Remus's chest. Sirius leans forward again, entirely covering Remus's cock this time, and Remus has to use every fiber of resistance in his body not to thrust into the tight, warm vacuum made by Sirius's lips. He uses his tongue, a lot of it, dragging along the length of Remus's cock and circling the head, lapping at his slit and the liquid that gathers there on every other pass. It's a heady, disorienting experience, heat surging through his veins like liquid lava, burning him up from the inside in the most exquisite torture as Remus sinks deeper and deeper into the chasm of unadulterated pleasure that Sirius leads him into. It's impossible for him to stay quiet after a while, and he eventually gives up any pretense of restraint in that area as well, a litany of moans and whimpers falling from his lips as Sirius takes him apart piece by piece. Sirius, seeming spurred on by Remus's noises, presses forward, taking Remus deeper, until Remus feels himself touching the back of Sirius's throat, holding himself there for long seconds. He drags back in a tight, sucking pull that makes Remus cry out with a piercing sound. Sirius slides the flat of his tongue all the way back to the very tip, and suddenly, Remus is there, right there, waves of pleasure taking over him all at once. He is balancing over the edge of the precipice one moment and falling off of it the next, barely enough of a second in between to gasp out.
I'm go.
Sirius sucks him through it, swallowing everything, which is so much hotter than it has any right to be. Remus had never even expected Sirius to do something like this. Wasn't this sort of thing Remus's job? He has no time to ponder these questions. The moment he's done, Sirius pulls back and sits back on his heels, gazing up at Remus with an expectant look. Remus, shuddering and panting hard through the aftershocks, deflates against the bar.
I'm sorry.
He says,
I'm sorry, sir. I tried. I didn't.
I know.
Sirius says. He pushes himself up to his feet and straightens his own clothes.
I almost ruined that orgasm for you, but I didn't want that to be your first experience this weekend. And I was, admittedly, curious.
Remus looks at him.
Curious.
Sirius smiles.
To see what you look like when you come.
Remus looks away on instinct, hiding the way his face heats up at the words, but quickly catches himself and returns his eyes to Sirius's. He thinks he can very easily get lost in those eyes.
Thank you, sir.
But,
Sirius continues.
as I told you before, I have rules.
Sirius reaches for Remus's cock, not fully soft yet and still sensitive from his orgasm. The unexpectedness of Sirius's hand around him makes Remus flinch, but Sirius doesn't release him, only trails a finger lightly along the length of it as he continues, his tone uncompromising but deceptively gentle.
You don't come. You don't even so much as think about it, unless I tell you that you can. If we're going to continue to see each other, that applies for when we're together as well as when you're on your own. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Remus says quickly. He does. He'll be better. He wants this to work. Sirius releases him and moves his other hand up to cradle Remus's face instead.
You are everything that I've ever wanted.
Sir,
Remus whispers.
you're everything I wanted too. Would you?
Yes, darling.
God, Remus loves it when he does that. No one has ever called Remus darling or anything like that before, but Sirius uses the pet names liberally, like Remus is something soft and precious and important, something worthy of being Sirius's. Sirius leans in closer, pressing a soft kiss to Remus's forehead, the tip of his nose, his cheek.
Tell me what you want.
Remus isn't even sure what he wants. He thinks that everything might be a severe understatement. The only thing he's sure of is Sirius, in front of him, their lips centimeters away from each other, but not touching, its own form of torture.
You.
Remus eventually manages, forcing the word out through the layers of self-conscious resistance that have mounted themselves between his brain and his mouth. Sirius makes a soft sound at the back of his throat, and Remus knows he isn't satisfied with this response.
Do you want me to fuck you, baby? Then you need to ask for it.
Sirius tells him. Despite having just come, Remus's cock twitches slightly with interest. Sirius brushes his lips against Remus's and then pulls back almost instantly.
I want you to fuck me.
Remus says, his voice shaking. He thinks he understands Sirius's game. He knows Sirius will likely keep him here all day, strung tight and wanting, but never receiving anything beyond the barest of touches until Remus gives in. Sirius raises a brow and Remus flushes. He thinks that he stands a good chance of remaining a permanent shade of red by the time Sirius is finished with him.
Please, sir.
He whispers. Sirius rewards him with a kiss and says,
I'm going to get something. I want you naked by the time I get back.
Remus swallows hard as Sirius releases him. He watches as Sirius walks over to the trolley with their bags and opens one of his suitcases, seemingly paying Remus no mind. Remus, suddenly remembering that he's been left with a task, fumbles clumsily with his jeans but manages to get them off along with his underwear, leaving himself standing stark naked in the middle of the living room. The giant windows let in all of the light from the early evening sun, and Remus knows that, logically, they are too high up for anyone to see them. But he cannot help the embarrassment that threatens to take him over at the thought of someone looking in, especially when Sirius is fully dressed, save for his blazer, but looking as impeccable and put together as ever. Sirius returns to Remus with an all-too-familiar bottle in his hand, and Remus has only a second to glimpse it before Sirius orders him to turn around. Remus bites down hard on the inside of his cheek and obeys without comment. His body feels as though it's lost all functionality, and it takes considerable effort to get his feet to cooperate. But he manages. Molding himself to Remus's back, Sirius takes Remus's hands and guides them to where he wants them, silently instructing Remus to hold on to the edge of the bar. He squeezes Remus's wrists lightly as he pulls back, the order to keep himself in that position implicit. Remus lets out a shaky breath and presses his eyes shut, awaiting Sirius's next move. Sirius doesn't keep him waiting long, and the lubed fingers spreading Remus's cheeks and pressing against his entrance are not unexpected, but still startle a moan out of Remus at the feel of them. It's not been that long since he's done this to himself, on Sirius's orders, writhing against his own fingers under the covers of his bed, as Sirius whispered the filthiest things imaginable into his ear. But it has been a while since he's had someone else do it to him, and he's almost forgotten how different the sensation is. How much better it is when he does not have to awkwardly angle his own wrists, but can instead sink into the moment and allow himself to only feel. Sirius enters him with 2 fingers at once, while his free hand moves to Remus's front, brushing against the length of his cock with just enough subtly applied pressure that Remus has to fight with every fiber of his being not to thrust forward. He's hard again, which is not surprising given he is here with Sirius, and Sirius lets out a breath-y laugh when he realizes the same thing. It's mortifying, really, that Sirius knows how desperate Remus is for his touch, but fuck, Remus can't really bring himself to care.
I thought about doing so many things to you once we got here.
Sirius says, the words soft and spoken directly into Remus's ear.
But now I can't seem to decide what I want to do first.
So do them all, Remus thinks. Sirius's fingers are pressed inside of him as deep as they can go, but he is avoiding Remus's prostate with what has to be intentionality, barely even moving them at all, and Remus can't move his hips because he's certain that Sirius will only pull away entirely if he does. He feels like he is one wrong move away from spontaneous combustion, and he knows that he is one wrong move away from Sirius refusing to touch him for the rest of the night. And so he holds himself utterly, painstakingly still, and resigns himself to letting Sirius do as he pleases. Until Sirius crooks one of his fingers ever so slightly, pressing just right, and God, against that spot, and Remus cracks instantly.
Please,
He whispers, his voice breaking the word into 2 hoarse syllables.
please, sir.
Sirius doesn't pull away or answer, but he does push another finger into him, twisting it against his prostate one more time. Remus moans or sobs, he's not quite sure. It's possibly an amalgamation of both.
That's better.
Sirius murmurs, delighted.
Do you think I won't notice when you hide your reactions from me?
Remus sniffs.
No, sir.
I want to hear everything.
Sirius reminds him.
I want to hear every sound you make.
Sir,
Sirius withdraws his fingers, and the empty sensation leaves Remus feeling as if he's lost some integral part of himself. It is abated only by the sounds he hears next, the blessed sound of a zipper being lowered, and the telltale sound of fabric being rearranged. His breath catches in his throat as more lube is poured over his hole, and the sound he makes would be embarrassing in any other context, as Sirius presses into him. He goes slowly, letting Remus get adjusted to the size of him still stretching at his walls despite the 2 fingers he'd had as prep. Remus grapples with increasing franticness at the counter he is pressed against, desperate for an anchor against the onslaught of sensation and receiving none. His jilted breath breaks into a moan as Sirius tightens his grip on Remus's hips, pulling him back just as he presses forward. Pleasure bursts through him like a volcano on the verge of eruption, his heartbeat throbbing against his chest. Sirius thrusts in, once hard, groaning softly as he sheathes himself fully, as deep as he can go, holding himself there. Remus makes a soft, whining sound, and Sirius laughs, low and deep, grinding his hips forward. The head of his cock rubs perfectly against Remus's prostate.
There.
Sirius asks, repeating the motion. Thrust, grind, thrust, grind. Remus squeezes his eyes together so hard that he sees sparks fluttering off behind the closed lids.
Sir God, yes.
Thrust.
Like that.
Yes.
Sirius fucks him that way, deep and hard, until Remus's mind is so scattered that he begins to forget where he even is. The time of day, the city they're in, all of it fades unceremoniously to black, relegated to the status of being mere unimportant details that pale in comparison to the feeling of Sirius inside of him, taking him apart with expert efficiency. His thrusts don't pick up pace until Remus is a shuddering mess, trembling at the slightest of touches, and Sirius touches him a lot, in every spot that his hands can reach, toying with his nipples, stroking his cock, cupping his balls, until Remus is lost in sensation and does not quite know how to process any of it. He feels all at once exhausted and more energized than he's ever been. He is nothing but clay to be molded by Sirius's vision. He gasps.
Can I?
Come.
Sirius says a whispered order into the skin at the juncture of Remus's neck and jaw, a gentle bite to punctuate the expectation of obedience. Remus lets everything go with a cry, relenting any pretense of control he'd had over himself and giving it over to the pressure building inside of him, letting it spread and spread, his body spasming with the shock of it. He tightens himself on Sirius's cock, an entirely involuntary action he is aware of only for the way Sirius curses when he does it, slamming into him as if his own life depends on it.
God, Remus.
He groans, jerking his hips forward. Remus moans as liquid heat flows into him, every spurt accompanied by Sirius's shuddering motions. His hands still hold tightly to Remus's hips. Soft kisses are layered against his skin, every inch of skin Sirius's lips can reach. He thinks vaguely that this must be heaven. Sometime later, Remus finds himself in the shower. Just as he had earlier that day before Sirius picked him up, he scrubs himself clean, washes his hair, brushes his teeth, applies the fancy body scrub that Dorcas, his best friend, got him for his birthday earlier in the year, the one that makes his skin feel smooth and soft to the touch, and which smells vaguely of coconuts and sunshine. He looks at himself in the mirror when he is finished, and wonders if the person in the reflection really is as unfamiliar to him as they appear to be. He feels more himself than he ever has before, and yet at the same time he feels nothing like himself at all. Strangest of all is the fact that it is not as disorienting a feeling as he expects it to be.
I ordered room service.
Sirius says as Remus eventually steps out of the bathroom. Remus pauses, startled, on the threshold, peering out at Sirius from behind the towel in his hands, which had been rubbing vigorously at his hair to get the rest of the water out. Sirius is sitting on the edge of the bed. He raises a brow at Remus, looking highly entertained.
I have a hairdryer.
Of course he does. Remus, by comparison, doesn't think he's ever actually owned a hairdryer.
Won't it just air dry?
He asks, resuming his rubbing. Sirius opens his mouth, starts to say something, and then seemingly decides against it. He laughs slightly and stands up.
I ordered room service.
He repeats.
It's in the kitchen. You can order anything else you like, of course. I left the menu there.
Okay.
Remus says, even though he knows he won't be ordering anything. Sirius stands, and only then does Remus take in the fact that he's changed into joggers and a t-shirt, and there's a small duffel bag on the bed next to him.
Are you going somewhere?
Remus asks. Sirius hums.
There's a gym downstairs. I'll only be gone for a couple of hours.
Oh.
Remus says, nodding despite his confusion.
So we won't be eating together?
Sirius laughs as if Remus has said something funny.
No. I'm sure you can use some time for yourself.
Remus blinks. Oh.
Well, yeah, that sounds okay. I'll just...
Perfect,
Sirius says. He picks up the duffel and walks over to Remus, pressing a kiss to his forehead.
I'll see you in a couple of hours.
Remus does end up ordering room service eventually. once he's talked himself out of calling Dorcas for reassurance that Sirius leaving him right after fucking him into oblivion doesn't necessarily mean anything. He eats by himself out on the balcony, which has a gorgeous view over the city that makes him wish he could be sharing this moment with Sirius instead. When he finally makes his way back inside, he pours himself another glass of the wine they'd opened earlier and finds that he still hates it, but that it comforts him a little to think of Sirius as he drinks it. He wakes up alone, with a blanket thrown over him that hadn't been there when he'd fallen asleep. The book he'd been reading, Heart of Darkness, an awful frustrating thing, really, but he's been tasked with doing a term paper on it, so he has no choice but to suffer through the entire thing, is resting on the nightstand with his phone next to it. It's dark, and he is warm and comfortable, and he almost doesn't want to leave the bed at all. The temptation to roll over and bury his face into the amazingly soft pillows almost winning him over. But Sirius isn't here. With a sigh, he stretches his arm out to get the phone, switching it on to check the time. 2:32 a.m. There's a heavy feeling in his chest that, if Remus is being honest with himself, has been burrowing itself a home there ever since Sirius walked out of the hotel room, however many hours ago. He tries to convince himself to go back to sleep, but the presence of the blanket and the book on the nightstand makes him aware of the fact that Sirius had come back at some point, and once that thought worms its way into his brain, there is no getting it out again. He stands and makes his way out of the room. He finds Sirius at the small dining table in the living room, his laptop opened in front of him. He's wearing glasses, which Remus hadn't expected but realizes immediately he is very, very fond of, and he doesn't notice Remus until the latter announces himself with a soft, almost inaudible.
Hi.
Sirius looks up. A gentle smile appears at the sight of Remus, and it is almost enough to make Remus forget that he'd been upset, or that he'd even had anything to be upset about.
It's late.
Sirius says in lieu of a greeting. It isn't a reprimand. Spoken softly as it is, it's merely an observation, but Remus still dislikes it. Dislikes feeling like he's intruding.
How are you feeling?
Sirius asks, and Remus doesn't answer. How is he feeling? Lost, maybe. Alone. But those things aren't Sirius's fault, are they? They certainly aren't Sirius's problem. Had Remus really expected him to not only pay for this extravagant getaway, but to also take on the burden of providing Remus with constant attention, he should have stayed in the bedroom.
Is everything okay?
Sirius asks, brows creased with concern. He lowers the screen of the laptop.
Do you need something?
You, Remus thinks, in that awful, bitter voice that he wishes would just stay quiet. I waited for you, he wants to say. He thinks he might choke on the words if he tries. I waited for you, and you didn't come.
Can I stay?
Remus asks. His voice sounds distant, unfamiliar. The words are garbled as if he'd spoken them underwater, but Sirius seems to understand him anyway.
Of course.
He says immediately. He stands and stretches out his hand, and Remus goes towards him.
Are you sure you're all right?
Sirius asks, pulling Remus closer and resting a hand on his waist.
Yes.
Remus says, though he knows it's a lie even as he says it. His heart is racing, and his skin feels too hot, and everything feels a little bit too much at the moment.
Hey.
Sirius says softly, cradling a hand to Remus's jaw to stop him from looking away.
Talk to me.
Remus shakes his head. His eyes are burning, but he isn't quite certain why until Sirius brushes a thumb against his cheek.
Okay.
Sirius says, his tone soothing.
You don't have to say anything, but can I try something? I need you to listen to me. That's all you need to do, baby. Just listen to me.
Yes, sir.
Remus whispers. Sirius smiles.
Good boy. You're absolutely perfect for me, Remus.
Remus doesn't feel particularly perfect. He feels rather the opposite, really. Broken, ruined, wrong.
Hey.
Sirius says,
Don't do that. Don't get lost in your head. Focus on me and only me. Nothing else matters right now. Look at me.
He does. Gray eyes look back at him, and Remus sees none of the panic that is steadily rising within his own body reflected back at him in those eyes. He allows himself to get lost in them, in the way they make him feel safe and secure and steady, until his breathing slowly evens itself out. Sirius smiles at him.
Good boy. Now, I want you to take your clothes off for me. This is another rule we'll have. Whenever you spend time with me and we're inside and alone, like this, you'll be naked. I enjoy being able to see what belongs to me.
Remus likes the idea of belonging to Sirius, not just his body, but every part of him. He'd only put on a pair of pajama pants and one of Sirius's t-shirts, which Sirius tugs the hem of as he patiently waits for Remus to do as he says. Remus keeps his eyes on Sirius's as he swiftly strips himself. He thinks only of Sirius's words and nothing else, even as he stands naked, folding and placing the discarded clothing on the chair in front of the desk. Sirius moves away to sit on the other chair, the one he'd been in when Remus interrupted him, and spreads his legs. Remus flushes brightly as he feels his cock twitch at just the thought of what he's about to do next, whatever that might be, and Sirius stares unabashedly at him, drinking in his reaction.
Come here, down on your knees.
Sirius says, and Remus drops with as much gracefulness as he can muster, which isn't much, and adjusts himself so he's comfortably nestled in the spot Sirius directs him to, under the desk. Sirius waits patiently until Remus has figured himself out, and then he sits up, tangling his fingers in Remus's hair. He tugs once, pulling Remus's head back, elongating his neck in the process, and Remus's cock grows harder.
You won't touch yourself while you're down there.
Sirius says,
Do what you like with your hands, but if they go anywhere near your cock, you won't like what I do in return. Understood?
Yes, sir.
Remus breathes.
Good boy.
Sirius praises.
Now take me out. You're not getting me off. I still have work to do and I need to focus. You're going to stay still and quiet and keep my cock in your mouth until I'm finished working. Since you won't be able to say your safe word, you'll tap your fingers against my thigh if you need me to stop. Show me.
Remus raises a hand and taps 2 fingers in rapid succession against Sirius's thigh.
Perfect. You're perfect.
Sirius says. He releases his grip on Remus's hair and smooths his fingers through it instead, his touch gentler now but still firm, until Remus leans into him with a soft noise at the back of his throat. He feels contented.
Go on.
Sirius says. Remus raises his hands to the waistband of Sirius's sweatpants, and Sirius raises his hips enough that Remus can pull it down. Hesitantly, Remus glances back up to seek confirmation that Sirius wants him to take it off completely. Sirius nods once, and Remus swallows back the nerves that have begun to consume him as he does what was asked of him. He already feels out of place enough as is. He doesn't need to feel like any more of a disappointment. He gets the sweatpants off, folds them, and hesitates for a second as he cannot figure out where to put them, until Sirius reaches forward and takes them from him. He places them on the table, and then wraps a hand around his cock. It's already hard, though not fully so, and Remus watches mesmerized as Sirius lazily strokes himself. The way his head peeks out from beneath the foreskin, the firmness of his grip, the bead of precum which settles on the tip, almost as if acting on instinct and overcome by curiosity as to what Sirius tastes like, Remus leans forward and swipes his tongue over it. Sirius lets out the softest moan, and Remus, spurred on by the sound of it, does it again.
Take me in your mouth.
Sirius says from above him. Remus swipes his tongue over his lips and replaces Sirius's hand with his own. He guides Sirius's cock into his mouth, feeling the weight of it resting against his tongue. Sirius's hand finds his hair again, a light touch, just holding him there.
Remember what I said.
He asks.
You're not getting me off. Just hold me in your mouth like this.
It is a simple enough request, one that Remus actually thinks he can manage to do without messing things up any further. He closes his eyes, leans his head against Sirius's thigh, and refocuses his worrying onto breathing through his nose instead. Slowly, he feels himself start to calm. He pays attention to the sound of Sirius's typing, the feel and taste of Sirius's in his mouth, the way his heart becomes less of a thundering, uncomfortable drum beating against chest and more of a steady beat. He feels himself sinking, like being pulled underwater, but not in a bad way. He feels contained, but comfortable, at ease, safe. It's only too easy after that to let himself drift. He comes back to himself slowly. Sirius's hands are brushing through his hair, and there are soft praises falling from his lips as he pulls Remus back to himself. Sirius smiles at him when he finally has enough presence of mind to raise himself up. Sirius's spit-slick cock is still half hard in his mouth, and Remus lets his tongue drag along the base of it as he pulls back. Sirius inhales sharply, a heated look in his eyes, and raises a brow.
We're not finished yet.
Remus nods. He places his hand into Sirius's outstretched palm and lets himself be guided up. He still feels like he's floating, all of his thoughts a little bit hazy around the edges, but he lets himself fall into Sirius's open arms, knowing with absolute certainty that Sirius will catch him.
God, Remus, you're fucking perfect like this.
Sirius tells him. Remus whines, pressing himself closer and tucking his face into Sirius's neck, breathing in deeply. Sirius swipes his hands up and then down Remus's back.
It's okay, baby. I know what you want.
Remus, admittedly, had not even been aware of his own arousal until Sirius's words made him take notice of it. He's hard, his cock pulsing with need. The feeling coils tight in the pit of his stomach, and he clings to Sirius tighter as he tries to convey this.
Good boy.
Sirius praises him.
You're so good for me, Remus. Come on, come here.
Sirius keeps his arms wrapped around him as he guides him back into the bedroom and over to the bed, helping him to arrange himself so that he is lying down flat on his back, his arms and legs outstretched.
Wider.
Sirius says, tapping lightly on his left ankle before applying pressure to it. Remus does as he's bid and spreads his legs as far apart as they can go. Sirius moves away from the bed then, and Remus hears him rummaging about in one of the bags. He doesn't look because he hasn't been told to, and so he stares at the ceiling fan spinning above him instead, waiting patiently. He knows that Sirius will take care of him. When Sirius returns, Remus feels the bed dip, and then jolts as something touches him, more out of surprise than anything else. Sirius urges him to be still, and Remus nods his agreement. He stays still and quiet as Sirius moves around the bed, attaching what feels like some form of leather strap to each of his ankles and then his wrists, securing him firmly against the posts. There's very little give on every one of them, and Remus realizes with a full body tremor that he really is at Sirius's mercy right now.
Breathe, darling.
Sirius reminds him.
Let me make you feel good now.
The bed dips again, and familiar fingers card gently through his hair as Sirius presses a soft kiss to his lips, then down the length of his neck and across his collarbone.
You look stunning,
he says.
Someone would pay a fortune to see you like this.
Despite his current state of abject vulnerability and the way that nothing feels particularly real at the moment, Remus breathes out a laugh. He wants to point out that Sirius already has paid a fortune to see him like this, but he doesn't even want to think about the total cost of this trip. Certainly not the palatial room, or the food he'd ordered earlier, or the restaurant they'd stopped at before they'd even gotten here. Remus had, upon his very first interaction with Sirius all those months ago, assumed that the only thing Sirius would ever want from him was sex, even if it was just virtual sex. He'd been fine to content himself with just that. He certainly hadn't been looking for a benefactor who carried him to fancy restaurants and brought him along on lavish vacations. And he definitely hadn't expected that Sirius would want to do this long term, that he'd be at all interested in being in, well, maybe not a relationship, but something akin to it, for more than just this weekend. It's entirely unfathomable to him that this is his real life, and almost impossible for him to think that it could continue to be his real life, even after they leave this hotel. If he pleases Sirius. Remus doesn't get a chance to work himself into worrying about that caveat before Sirius is on him again. He continues his trail of kisses to Remus's nipples, his tongue swirling against one while his fingers work the other, and Remus gasps and moans and arches into it as much as his bonds will allow before forcing his body back down flat against the bed, lest Sirius decide to punish him by stopping.
I love how sensitive you are here.
Sirius murmurs against him, blowing against the now hardened nub he'd been using his tongue on. Remus moans, wants to twist and writhe as Sirius returns to toying with him.
How would you feel about a piercing?
Truthfully, Remus has never thought about it, but right at that moment he has no objections. He's sure he would do anything Sirius asks him to do, if only he never stops playing with his nipples. Sirius laughs.
We'll revisit the topic.
He isn't sure how long they stay there after that, with Sirius's tongue and fingers working in tandem, until all that Remus knows is the arousal flowing through his body. It is an odd and disorienting feeling when paired with the fact that Sirius, despite Remus's pleading, stays far from Remus's cock. He feels as if he's chasing something that is just out of his reach, and he's hard enough that it borders on painful. But Sirius doesn't let up, occasionally switching which nipple gets the soft, wet heat of his mouth, and which gets the harsher tug and press of his fingers, but never leaving either one unattended for more than a second. He locks Remus into an uncompromising chamber of pure sensation until Remus's mind is blank and he's drifting helplessly, unaware of anything that isn't Sirius's touch against his skin. He feels stranded when it finally stops, a million pricks of lightning sparking off from his chest in search of what they've just lost, and he cannot help but whine as he feels Sirius pulling away and leaving him there like that. He hears Sirius laugh, a low and distant sound that Remus cannot quite pin the location of, with his eyes squeezed shut as they are.
It's okay, baby.
Sirius says,
Do you see how good you're being? All you have to do is stay right there and continue being good for me. Can you do that for me?
Remus doesn't answer, assuming it must be a rhetorical question. Certainly Sirius doesn't expect coherent words from him right now. Sirius, however, does. He pinches one of Remus's nipples again, this time much harder than he'd done before, hard enough that Remus is instantly aware that it is a punishment, a small one, but enough of one that he opens his eyes and blinks rapidly until he locates Sirius above him.
I asked you a question, darling.
Sirius says, his voice a stark contrast to the pain in Remus's nipple. Remus swallows, nods, remembers what Sirius had told him earlier in the day and quickly corrects himself.
Yes, sir.
Tell me what you want.
Sirius says. He strokes a hand down the flat expanse of Remus's chest and down to his pelvis. Remus's cock twitches with the proximity.
Please, sir, I want you to fuck me.
Remus whispers.
Of course that's what you want.
Sirius says. In the periphery of Remus's line of vision, which is focused intently on the heated gaze in Sirius's eyes, he sees Sirius lean over him, onto the nightstand.
Should I also tell you what I want?
Sirius continues. Remus watches as Sirius settles himself again, and as he flicks open the cover on the bottle of lube he'd picked up, he squirts out a generous amount onto his open palm.
Yes, sir.
Remus says softly.
Please.
Sirius smirks and throws the bottle to the side of them. His fingers, glistening with the substance, move downwards, and Remus gasps as he feels the cool sensation of it against his entrance. Not entering him, just rubbing in slow, gentle circles, teasing him.
Please.
He whines. He cannot move, cannot get enough purchase to even shift his hips the way that he wants to. He is completely and utterly at the mercy of Sirius's desires.
This is what I want.
Sirius says,
You mindless underneath me, submitting to whatever I choose to do to you.
Sir.
I want you out of your mind with how desperate you are for me.
Sirius says, ignoring Remus's begging entirely. He leans down so his mouth is near Remus's ear, his breath hot against Remus's neck.
I want to consume you, Remus.
Yes.
Remus starts, but he's cut off by Sirius, entering him with 2 fingers at once, a stretch for sure, but one that feels oh so good. Sirius sinks them as deep as they can go, crooking them just right, canceling out whatever burn had been there just moments before. His fingers are just as efficient at making Remus lose all concept of time, space, and being as they had been earlier, when Sirius had fingered him open against the bar. If turning Remus mindless is Sirius's goal, then Sirius is sure to accomplish it within no time at all. Remus groans as he feels the press of a 3rd finger, and cries out when Sirius pushes it in alongside the other 2. It is so good, it's beyond good, beyond anything Remus has ever felt before. He'd never imagined that sex could feel like this, such an otherworldly, all-encompassing experience. As Sirius fucks him with those 3 fingers, every nerve in his body is alight with pleasure. He feels like he is on the verge of combustion. And then he feels the pressure of a 4th.
Hush, you can take it.
Sirius says to him, seemingly sensing Remus's imminent panic. It's more than he's ever taken before, even by himself. And Sirius's hands are big, his fingers long. 3 is already a tight fight. There's no way.
You can.
Sirius assures him again, and it's like a switch in Remus's brain, connected directly to Sirius's voice. Sirius says that he can, so it must be true.
Do you remember your safe word?
Sirius asks. Remus notes that the fingers already inside of him have stopped moving. He inhales deeply, a ragged breath that seems to shake his entire body, and nods.
Red.
He says.
Would you like to use it?
A pause. The 4th finger moves away.
No.
Remus shakes his head.
No, please, I can't. I'll try.
You will.
Sirius asks and his finger returns. The three inside of him twist, slowly, and Remus moans.
Please, sir, anything. Anything you want.
Anything?
Sirius asks. He seems to take pity on Remus's state, because he does not push for an answer. The fourth finger enters Remus carefully, and in the very back of his mind, in the place where cognizant thought is still somewhat present, Remus is aware that Sirius is giving him time to reconsider, to change his mind. Remus, however, is determined to do anything but. It hurts, but it's a good hurt, the kind that morphs into desire, that only leaves him wanting more. Sirius is patient and careful, and Remus feels very fragile at this moment, but he knows, he trusts, that Sirius will take care of him. When all four fingers are into the hilt, Sirius pauses and gives Remus time to adjust. Remus feels so full, so unfathomably full. The intensity is almost unbearable, tethering on the edge of his pain threshold.
I'll fist you one of these days.
Sirius murmurs. Slowly, he begins to move his fingers again. Remus can do nothing but take it.
I'll do everything to you.
Sirius continues. His voice is smooth like honey, like the finest, rarest wine, an intoxicating thing.
I'll do things that you haven't even thought of yet. Things you never even imagined you'd let someone do to you. You'll be completely and utterly mine.
Remus cries out as Sirius expands his fingers, stretching Remus wider. Remus can feel it in his toes, up his spine, in the very depths of himself, places he didn't even know existed.
Is that what you want?
Sirius asks.
Yes.
Clothes expand.
Tell me.
Sirius says.
Tell me you want it.
I want it.
Tell me you love it.
Remus sobs.
I love it.
Expand. Remus hiccups, feeling lost in some chamber of pleasure. Sirius brushes his free hand against the side of his face.
I know you do, baby.
Sir, please, will you?
Do you want to come?
Sirius asks. Remus nods, unable to muster the ability to actually use the words. Sirius, once again, seems to take pity on him.
Okay, darling, you can come for me.
Sirius wraps his free hand around Remus's cock, and that's all it takes, really. He shatters apart, detonates into a million pieces as Sirius's fingers stroke against all the right spots inside of him, prolonging the feeling for as long as it can be. He keeps it up until Remus is shaking, broken, unintelligible words falling from his lips. Only then does Sirius remove his fingers with as much care as he'd used to enter him. Slowly, Remus comes down from the height, that same faraway, hazy feeling that he'd had earlier settling over him once more, pulling him under. He isn't aware of much else after that. The light streaming in from the window brushes against his skin, a delicious contrast to the coolness of the room, letting him know before he even opens his eyes that it is now morning, or perhaps afternoon. He certainly feels as if he's been asleep for a longer time than usual, particularly after the night he's had, and he definitely feels better now than he had when he'd woken up before, more aware of himself, his head clearer and well rested, though that last one doesn't seem as if it was particularly hard to come across, given that he slept in a bed that feels more like a cloud. He doesn't startle when he feels fingers gently carding through his hair. Given how many times Sirius has taken the opportunity to touch it, Remus thinks that Sirius might rather like his hair. Remus has never taken much notice of it himself. It's a rather uninspiring shade brown, and somehow manages to be both too long and too short at the same time. It doesn't frame his face quite as elegantly as Sirius's does, and it's certainly not as soft or as fluffy. But Sirius seems to like it, so maybe it isn't quite as bad as Remus had led himself to believe.
You're awake.
Sirius says softly, not a question, so Remus doesn't answer it. He blinks his eyes open and turns, finding Sirius behind him, propped up on one arm. Remus is still naked, but unfortunately Sirius is wearing clothes. Still wearing clothes, Remus realizes as he takes a better look at it. It's the same sweatpants and t-shirt from the night before. Had he ever taken them off? Remus frowns, thinking back.
Hey, what's wrong?
Sirius asks, his brows furrowing in concern. He cradles Remus's face.
You didn't last night. I fell asleep.
Remus says quietly. Horrified with himself, Remus's heart beats fast against his chest. He feels like he's failed. Oh God, and that's not even to mention the tantrum he threw right before. Why does he have to be so?
Remus, hey, look at me.
Sirius urges. It is not said in the same voice Sirius uses when he gives an order, but in a much gentler one. Remus does as he says anyway.
What are you worried about?
Sirius asks.
I.
Remus pauses. He can't say I'm worried that you don't want me anymore, because that seems so unbearably childish. But it's also the truth. He is worried that Sirius won't want him anymore. Why would he?
Okay, let me ask you another question.
Sirius says.
Do you know what happened to you last night? Do you understand why you felt the way you did?
Remus frowns again. He has a few choice words to describe his emotions from last night, but none of them are particularly favorable.
It's called subdrop. It happens sometimes, after you experience something intense. It can manifest in quite a few ways. It can be physical, or emotional, or mental. Basically, you start to feel off.
Remus looks up at him, processing his words. Had that been what it was?
We can talk about it more later today if you like. But I wanted to apologize now for leaving you alone last night. I didn't take into consideration how new you are to all of this. I should have been more attentive.
Somehow, even with the explanation of what had happened to him, Remus dislikes the idea of Sirius placing any of the blame onto himself. He shakes his head.
No, I'm sorry for being so needy. You shouldn't have to stay with me every single minute of our time here.
I like you being needy.
Sirius says, his voice soft but teasing. The spark in his eye is there for only a moment, though, before it returns its former somberness.
Especially when we're together like this. Remus, it's my job to look after you. Do you remember what I told you when we first got here? That if we continue doing this, I'll be responsible for you not just sexually, but for your other needs as well.
So you mean,
Remus starts.
you said, if we continue this, so you still want to?
Sirius gives a breathy laugh.
Yes, Remus, of course I do.
Oh,
Remus whispers. He closes his eyes, reopens them.
Would you like that?
Sirius asks him, and Remus doesn't have to think about it all.
yes.
He says emphatically. Sirius leans forward, kisses him deep and sure.
Wonderful.
He murmurs against Remus's lips.
I think we're going to be great together, darling.
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora, Caliana, and Flowerhawk.